Early morning, February, Boston, and the first news broadcast of the day carried footage of a warehouse burned down to its blackened steel frame at the harbor. The reporter's voice confirming that among the dead was Elias Marchetti, head of the Sable Point Group, a man whose name no one in this city had dared say too loudly in 10 years. 200 meters away, in a narrow alley behind a laundromat, the man just declared dead sat on frozen concrete, his white shirt gone the color of ash and torn open from shoulder to ribs, his hair matted at the temple, where blood had dried a deep brown, his bare feet blue against a road crusted with salt. Snow began falling again, light and slow. Heels clicked along the sidewalk, and a woman with platinum hair and a camel coat stopped at the mouth of the alley, tilted her head toward the shape in the dark corner, and laughed. "No way. Look closer. Do either of you recognize him?" She pulled out her phone and let the camera light fall straight across his face. "That right there is the man who promised to buy me an apartment overlooking the bay. 10 months ago I handed him back his ring, and he told me I'd live to regret it." She stepped back half a pace to fit him in the frame. "Look who's regretting it now, Elias." One of her friends tugged at her sleeve, half tired, half amused. "Come on, the man doesn't even have shoes." She shrugged and slid the phone into her pocket. "Well, I didn't take them off him." He did not raise his head, did not cover his face, did not say a word, because only one thing was still working inside him, the cold crawling from his bare feet up into his knees. They walked away, their laughter dying out at the end of the street, and the snow settled in a thin layer across his shoulders. Minutes later, a woman heading to her morning shift cut through the alley to save time, took 3 steps, and stopped. She set her bag down in the snow, unwound the only scarf she owned from around her neck, and knelt in front of the man the whole city had just been told was dead. She had no idea whose life she was touching, and that man, who in 10 years had never once been touched by someone who wasn't afraid of him, raised his head for the first time that morning. If this story reached you, leave a like, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to our channel to walk the rest of this road with us. She didn't help him to his feet right away. She stayed crouched there for a while longer, both hands still holding the scarf wrapped around his feet, her eyes fixed on skin that had already turned the color of something no longer belonging to the living. Then she looked up and spoke in the voice of someone calculating, not someone offering pity. "Can you walk?" He didn't answer. She repeated the question more slowly, separating each word. "Can you stand up? I'm asking seriously, because if you can't, I'll have to call someone, and if I call someone, they'll take you somewhere, and I don't think you want that." Something in that last sentence made him lift his eyes and look at her for the second time. He gave the smallest nod. She slipped one arm beneath his and pulled, and he was far heavier than she had expected, but she didn't make a sound. She only clenched her teeth and held her position until he managed to stand. They made their way down the entire alley like that, slowly and awkwardly, the scarf slipping farther behind them with every step. She didn't take him to her home. She turned toward the back entrance of the laundromat, unlocked a storage room filled with boxes of detergent and stacks of old towels, and pushed the door open before switching on the light. Inside stood an oil heater and a hot water faucet mounted to the wall. He remained at the threshold, looking in. No one had invited him into a place like this in 10 years. No one invited him anywhere. People only opened doors and stepped back. 3 days, she said, and it wasn't phrased as an offer. "You stay here for 3 days. There's hot water, there's heat, and I'll leave the back door key. On the 4th day, you leave, and I won't ask where you're going. I have a job, and I don't want to lose it. Do you understand?" He understood. What he didn't understand was why she spoke to him in that tone. The tone of someone laying down terms, the tone of someone negotiating rather than giving charity. All his life, he had heard only 2 kinds of voices, the pleading kind and the frightened kind, and this third voice was so unfamiliar that it took him a moment to realize he was being treated like an ordinary human being. She told him to take off his shirt. He hesitated. She continued, still calm. "You've been bleeding this whole time. I saw the trail in the snow all the way here." He removed the shirt, stiffened by cold and dried blood, and she looked at the long cut running down his left side without changing expression, without drawing a sharp breath, without stepping back even half a pace. She simply reached for the bottom drawer of the metal table in the corner, pulled out a flat tin box, opened it, and revealed things no one would have expected to find behind a laundromat. She washed her hands in hot water until her skin turned red. She poured antiseptic onto a piece of gauze and cleaned the edge of the wound in a single direction, never going back and forth. She gripped the needle, and the first stitch passed through his skin so neatly that he only had time to clench his hand before letting it relax again. 4 stitches. She counted them silently. The spacing between them was so even it was almost unsettling. He sat still and watched those hands work, fingers cracked from chemicals, nails cut close, and he realized they didn't tremble even once, not even when the small scissors moved close to his skin to cut the thread. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. She didn't answer. She cut the final strand of thread, placed a bandage over the wound, closed the tin box, and pushed the drawer shut with her knee. Then she stood, washed her hands again, and dried them with a towel taken from the stack of old ones. He watched her back, watched the way she folded the soiled towel into a separate bag instead of dropping it on the floor. And he didn't ask a second time. He had spent his entire life reading silences, and this silence had the shape of a door that had been locked for a very long time. "The heater makes a lot of noise, but it works," she said as she reached the door. "Don't turn it all the way up. The fuse in here is weak." Then she set the key on top of a detergent box, and before closing the door, she paused for the briefest moment. "My name is Delaney." He opened his mouth, and for exactly 1 second, his real name waited on the tip of his tongue, the name the entire city had heard on the morning news. He swallowed it. "Eli." She nodded. The door closed, and in that room filled with detergent, with the heater rattling like a machine on the verge of breaking down, the man who had once made the entire Boston waterfront lower its voice sat on the edge of a plastic chair, looked at the 4 perfectly straight stitches along his side, and asked himself a question he hadn't needed to ask in 10 years. Who was the woman who had just walked out through that door? That night, Delaney returned to her 3rd-floor apartment on Harrogate Street and stood for a long time in front of the wooden wardrobe in the corner of her bedroom, one hand resting on the handle without turning it. Inside the wardrobe, pushed against the very bottom, was a gray metal trunk the Harbor Authority had sent to her 3 years earlier, according to procedure. The personal belongings of an employee, complete with an inventory form, a signature, and even a printed sheet bearing a line of condolence they had probably reproduced hundreds of times in exactly the same words. She had signed for it. She had brought it home. She had shoved it beneath the wardrobe and closed the door. And for 3 years, she had never once opened the lid. There had been winters when she sat on the floor in front of that door. Once, she had placed both hands flat against the top of the trunk. Once, she had even managed to release one of the latches, but she had never gone all the way, because she knew what the smell inside would open inside her. Tonight, she sat down there again. She pulled the trunk out from beneath the wardrobe, and the layer of dust across the lid was so thick that she had to wipe it away with her sleeve. Then she remained still, staring at it for a long while. In the bedroom across the hall, the star-shaped night light was still glowing at its lowest setting, as it always did, and she could hear the steady breathing of her son drifting out into the hallway, the rhythm she had listened for every night over the past 3 years, to remind herself that there was still one reason to open her eyes each morning. She released both latches. There wasn't much inside, because Wyatt had never been a man who kept many things: a faded hard hat, a curled shift logbook, a thin leather wallet, stiffened by age, and at the bottom, taking up almost the entire floor of the trunk, were his steel-toed work boots, the boots he had worn on every night shift at the harbor, the leather worn pale where it bent across the top of the foot, the laces tied in a double loop that only he had ever tied that way, one sole still holding a trace of something gray from the dust along the docks. Delaney reached toward them, then drew her hand back. She did that 3 times. Then she lifted the boots with both hands, placed them in her lap, and sat there for a very long time beneath the dull yellow light of the bedside lamp. She didn't cry aloud. She didn't say anything. She only sat there, both hands resting on the old leather as though she were touching something that was still warm. The next morning, she took them with her. She wrapped them in a cloth bag, tucked them beneath her arm the way someone might carry a bundle of laundry, and walked through the street while it was still dark. She passed the front entrance of the laundromat, went around to the back, and slipped the key into the lock. Elias was sitting on the edge of the plastic chair, his back straight, both feet still wrapped in the bandages she had put on him the night before, and he looked up when the door opened. She didn't greet him. She walked directly into the middle of the room, bent down, and placed the boots on the concrete floor in front of him, carefully aligned, both toes pointing toward him, the way shoes are set before the door for someone preparing to travel far away. Then she stood, stepped back half a pace, and said only one sentence. "My husband doesn't need them anymore." He looked at her. She didn't look at him. She looked down at the boots, and in that single moment, something passed across her face and disappeared so quickly that he would have missed it if he had blinked. She cleared her throat. He worked at the harbor. Then one day, he didn't come home. She said it in the same voice someone might use to announce closing time. Then she turned away, picked up a stack of dry towels from the shelf, and straightened them even though they were already straight. After that, she stepped outside and closed the door very softly behind her. Elias lowered his eyes. He lifted the boots with both hands, and the instant the old leather touched his palms, he realized that his hands were trembling. It wasn't from the cold, because the room was warm. It wasn't from the stitches in his side, because he had endured far worse without so much as tightening his jaw. He sat there, the man who had ordered things no one in the city dared ask about, holding the boots of a dead man he had never met, and for the first time in 10 years, he didn't know what to call the feeling tightening around his chest. The boots fit perfectly, and that was what kept him sitting still for a long while after he finished tying the laces. He didn't leave the storage room at all that day. He only listened to the steady turning of the washing machines beyond the wall, and the sound of people coming and going beneath the chime of the front door. When the last light finally withdrew from the frosted window high above him, he opened the back door and stepped outside. He stood at the mouth of the alley for exactly 10 minutes, no longer, his hands in his trouser pockets, his face turned toward the wind coming in from the bay. He didn't need to call anyone. He only needed to stand somewhere he could be seen, because he knew there was still at least one man in the city searching for him the old way, which meant searching on foot rather than by telephone. Late that night, after the snow had stopped and the road had frozen into a smooth sheet of shine, a black sport utility vehicle pulled to the curb at the mouth of the alley and shut off its engine. The door opened. The man who stepped out was broad-shouldered and walked with a slight limp on his left side. He went straight into the alley without looking around even once, like someone who knew exactly what he would find. Hollis Pike stopped 3 steps away from Elias. Then he lowered himself onto one knee in the snow, bowed his head, and remained in that position until his voice had found its normal rhythm again. "I've been looking for you for 3 nights. 3 nights, sir." Elias didn't tell him to stand. He only looked down at the snow dusting the closely cropped hair of the man who had walked behind him for nearly a decade. And he allowed the silence to stretch for exactly as long as it needed to. Hollis opened the cloth bag he had brought, took out a shoebox with its paper folds still crisp, and placed it on the snow before his employer. Then he removed a sheet of paper folded into quarters and laid it on top of the lid. "I brought clothes, cash, a safe place north of the city, and this." He pushed the paper forward half an inch. 7 names. 7 people were in that room that night. They heard everything, and they chose to stand still. It took me 3 nights to reconstruct all 7 names. He looked up, and for the first time in the conversation, his eyes met Elias's directly. "Who do you want to begin with?" Elias reached out, but he didn't take the paper first. He pushed the shoebox aside with the toe of his boot. One slow, decisive motion, and the box slid across the snow until it came to rest against the wall. "I'm wearing these until the work is finished." Hollis looked down at his employer's feet, at the scuffed steel-toed work boots with their double-looped laces, tied in a way he had never seen Elias use before, and he asked nothing further, because it wasn't his place. Elias picked up the paper, opened it, and read. He read very slowly, from top to bottom, only once. Then he folded it back into quarters along the original creases, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. He didn't say a word about the 7 names. Hollis waited. He waited several moments longer, then understood there would be no answer, and he rose, brushing the snow from his knee. "You have to leave this neighborhood. Tomorrow morning, they'll start searching every row of houses." Elias turned toward the far end of the alley, where the light from the storage room spilled a thin yellow line across the snow. "I'm staying." Hollis was silent for a moment. "You don't need to hide anymore. All you have to do is step into the light, and everything ends before the morning is over." Elias shook his head. "If I come back to life today," Keen burns the ledger and disappears before lunch. Hollis understood. "But if you stay dead for a few more days, then he has to wait for the death certificate, and he has to sign the inheritance papers himself, in his own name, to take control." Elias lowered his eyes to the snow. No one can force him to sign. Only his greed can do that. Hollis nodded slowly, and in his mind he could see the trap closing with perfect clarity. A trap that needed no lock and no guard, only time and a man in too much of a hurry. "How much longer, sir?" "Until the ink is dry." Then Elias turned toward him, and his voice changed. It wasn't louder. It wasn't harsher. It simply lost the part of it that still belonged to conversation. "There's one more thing. This neighborhood, from the top of the street to the bus stop, the entire laundromat, and the whole row of buildings behind it." Hollis straightened. "No one in this neighborhood is to be touched. No one asks questions. No one stands watch outside any door. No one crosses a threshold here without my permission." The bodyguard studied his employer for another moment, and something in that order sent a colder feeling down his spine than the 7 names now resting inside the coat pocket before him. "Understood." The vehicle started and disappeared around the corner, its engine fading into the night, and Elias remained alone in the alley, while the new shoebox stayed exactly where he had pushed it, resting against the wall, unopened. On Tuesday morning, Delaney opened the front door earlier than usual, and she left the storage room door open by the width of a hand because the heater inside had run too hot all night. Elias sat in the corner of the main room on a wooden chair beside the dryer, both feet still wrapped in bandages and tucked inside the old boots, wearing a gray sweater she had found among the clothes customers had left behind the previous season. He wasn't doing anything. He was only sitting there, looking out through the window, and to anyone who walked in, he was simply a middle-aged man waiting for his laundry. The doorbell chimed. The man who entered was broad across the body, the collar of his coat turned up, carrying with him the smell of cigarettes mixed with the cold from outside. He didn't look around. He walked straight to the counter like someone who had taken this route so many times he no longer needed to watch where he was going. He slapped one hand down on the counter. Not very hard, only hard enough to make the loose coins in the tray jump. "It's the beginning of the month, sweetheart." Delaney set down the stack of towels she had been folding. "I told you last month. This laundromat isn't in your collection territory." He smiled, and there was nothing inside that smile. Territories change. People change too. You know how it is. There's been a lot happening up there lately. He leaned across the counter. 700, today. I don't like coming back a second time, and I like coming back with other people even less. She didn't step away. She remained where she was, both hands resting on the counter, and she was opening her mouth to answer when a voice came from the corner of the room behind him, so quiet that the man had to turn his head before he could hear it clearly. "How much does Warren Dolan still owe?" The man straightened. The smile stayed on his face for one more moment, then disappeared. "What did you say?" Elias didn't move. He remained seated on the wooden chair, both hands resting on his thighs, and he spoke the second sentence in exactly the same tone, not even slightly louder. "The account you opened last week at the Bowen Street branch. The account under your sister-in-law's name. Who do you think they'll question before they come to you?" The man said nothing. The blood drained from his face the way water pulls away from a stretch of sand, slowly, evenly, beyond resistance. He glanced at Delaney, very quickly, as though hoping she would say something to prove he had heard wrong. She didn't say anything. She didn't understand what was happening either. Elias looked down at his hands, then spoke a third time. "Go tell Ambrose Keene that someone is already collecting in this neighborhood." The only sound left in the laundromat was a dryer turning at the far end of the room, the steady clattering of a zipper striking the steel drum, and suddenly that sound seemed louder than everything else. The man stood motionless for exactly 3 breaths. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat, pulled out a thick envelope, and placed it on the counter. He set it down with both hands, the way someone would place something fragile. He didn't say a word. He turned and walked out, and at the doorway his foot caught on the mat. He stumbled half a step, then shoved the door so hard that the bell rang in a long burst before finally falling silent. Outside, through the glass clouded with steam, Delaney watched his shadow move quickly toward the end of the street without looking back once. She stood still for a long time. The envelope lay there on the counter between the tray of loose coins and the stack of towels she had left half-folded. Both her hands rested on the wood, and when she looked down, she saw that they were trembling, not because she was afraid of the man who had just left, but because of something else, something that had entered her laundromat without her noticing and had been sitting in the corner for the past 3 days, in the shape of a man without shoes. She turned to look at him. Elias was still sitting in exactly the same position, He didn't rise. He didn't approach the counter. He didn't touch the envelope. His eyes remained fixed on the window as though nothing had happened. Delaney heard herself ask the question, and she was surprised by how calm her voice sounded. "Who are you?" He was silent for a long while. Then he spoke without turning his head. "Today is the third day, isn't it?" She couldn't answer, and he didn't ask again. She didn't make him leave on the fourth day. She said nothing about it at all. She simply left the key in its usual place and a paper bag of bread on top of the detergent box. And that evening, she put on the nursing assistant uniform that still held the sharp creases from its packaging, took 2 buses across the city, and arrived for her first trial shift at Sable Point Rehabilitation Center. The place was clean in the way only money could make a place clean, with terrazzo floors reflecting the ceiling lights, hallways wide enough for footsteps to echo, and a large window at the end of every wing looking down over the black water of the bay. She stood at the nurse's station waiting for the shift handoff, a folder held against her chest, trying to keep her back straight in the way she had practiced for 3 years whenever she entered a building that smelled of antiseptic. A man approached from the opposite hallway, tall, with neatly combed salt and pepper hair, a white coat, and a paper cup of coffee in one hand. He stopped at the desk, set the cup down, and Delaney looked up at the identification badge hanging over the left side of his chest. Garrett Shaw, Director of Operations. Some names were names a person saw only on paper. She had never met this man once in her life, but she knew the shape of his name down to every stroke because it appeared at the bottom of the report that had ended her 11-year career. The report she had reread so many times that the paper had worn thin along the folds. For one heartbeat, she felt as though the air had been pulled out of her entire chest. She said nothing. He showed no reaction either. He only lowered his eyes to the name tag on her uniform and held them there half a second longer than necessary. Then he lifted his coffee and spoke in the voice of a man giving routine instructions. "Miss Cole, the night shift covers 4 rooms in the West Wing. You'll be working with Nurse Prescott, and I need you to remember one thing." He took a sip. "Here, we stay within our assigned roles." Then he walked away. Delaney remained beside the nurse's station, with both hands still fixed around the folder, and it took her nearly a minute to remember that she needed to breathe. The night shift passed with the rhythm of buildings like that, the steady blinking of monitors, the sound of rubber-soled shoes against terrazzo, the faint movement of someone turning in bed behind a half-open door. Then, near the middle of the shift, the call bell from room 11 rang twice in succession. The man inside had recently undergone major surgery at another hospital and had been transferred there to recover, and when Delaney pushed open the door, he was trying to sit up, his skin turning gray, his lips blue, each breath dragging upward with the sound of wind pushing through a crack in a door. The nurse on duty stood at the foot of the bed, the internal phone in her hand, calling for the second time with no answer. Delaney took in the scene once, and she knew immediately that this was a matter of minutes, not tens of minutes. She set the folder down. She raised the head of the bed, turned the patient onto his side, loosened the collar pressing against his throat, pulled the oxygen tank closer, and opened the valve. With her other hand, she pressed the emergency button mounted on the wall without needing to look for it. She spoke to the nurse in an even voice that never rose at all, and it was that calmness that brought the other woman back into motion. By the time the night team came running, the older man was breathing again. The blue had begun to fade from his lips, and the first thing everyone saw when they rushed through the doorway was a newly hired nursing assistant, dressed in a nursing assistant's uniform, doing things a nursing assistant wasn't legally permitted to do. No one said anything that night. In the morning, when Delaney signed out, she glanced at the incident report resting on the nurse's station. Every step had been recorded precisely, including the exact order in which she had acted. On the line marked Responding Clinician, there was only one name, written in blue ink with firm, neat strokes. Garrett Shaw. She stood there with the pen still in her hand. Then she heard footsteps behind her, and he was there, holding the same paper cup of coffee. He tipped his head toward the hallway. They walked about 10 paces away from the nurse's station, to a place outside the camera's view beside the window overlooking the bay. He didn't look at her. He looked down at the water. "Your license is suspended, Miss Cole. Touching a patient in that condition means you broke the law, and if anything had happened last night, they wouldn't have gone after this facility. They would have gone after you." He turned toward her, and his voice softened, almost becoming kind. "By putting my name on that report, I'm saving you." Delaney looked directly into the face of the man who had signed the document that ended her career, and she felt something rise into her throat, hot and bitter, demanding somewhere to escape. She swallowed it. She thought about the rent. She thought about the 2 bus rides. She thought about the star-shaped nightlight still glowing at its lowest setting across the city. "Yes, sir." He nodded with satisfaction and disappeared around the bend in the hallway. Delaney remained beside the window, looking down at the bay as the water began to change color, and she let both hands close into fists, tighter and tighter until her nails pressed into her palms. Then she opened them, straightened her collar, and walked toward the bus stop. She reached the laundromat before the sky had fully brightened, and instead of opening the front door as she usually did, she went around to the back and sat down on the concrete step, still wearing the nursing assistant uniform beneath her coat, her handbag beside her, both arms wrapped around her knees. A thin strip of snow from the night before still clung to the base of the wall. She sat there doing nothing, her eyes fixed on the empty space between the 2 rows of buildings, and she remained there so long that when the back door opened, she didn't turn her head. Elias stepped outside, looked at her for a moment, then sat down on the step at a respectful distance, no closer. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He only sat there with both hands resting on his knees, allowing the silence between them to remain like something with weight. That was the only reason she began to speak. "Do you know what it feels like to stand there and watch your name being erased from a piece of paper?" He didn't answer. "I used to be an operating room nurse. Night shift, St. Aubin Hospital, 11 years, including the years I spent in training. I wasn't the best person there, but I was the one they called when a difficult case came in at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I thought that was probably close enough to being the best." She spoke in the voice someone might use to read through a list, steady and without rise or fall. "My husband worked nights at the harbor. His name was Wyatt. We used to joke that no one in our family ever saw the sun. He came home when I left for work, and I came home when he woke up. Every day, we had about 40 minutes together in the space between, and those 40 minutes were the best thing I ever had in my life." She paused and brushed a little snow from the step beside her. "Then one day, he didn't come home. They called me while it was still dark. I remember asking the same question 3 times, because I couldn't understand what they were saying." Elias didn't move. The boy still couldn't speak in full sentences then. The only thing he knew was that every night his father walked through the door, and every morning his father walked through it again. For a long time afterward, he still stood in that exact place, at that exact hour. I thought he didn't understand, but he waited. She cleared her throat very softly, then continued more quickly, like someone trying to get through a dangerous stretch of road as fast as possible. "After the funeral came the bills. They took him to the hospital before it was over. So there was one night in a hospital bed, an ambulance, an emergency room, and all kinds of charges I had never even heard named before. My profession had taught me how to read every line, and that made it worse, because I understood exactly what I owed and exactly what each charge was for. I took extra shifts. I worked the shifts no one else wanted. I kept everything together. For 9 months, I kept it together." She lowered her eyes to her hands. "Then one morning, the medication count in my unit came up short. It was a drug that required 2 signatures before anyone could remove it. It wasn't much, but it was enough to trigger an internal investigation. 3 weeks later, they held a meeting, a closed meeting. I wasn't allowed to be there. I wasn't allowed to read the file. And I wasn't allowed to know who had been sitting in that room. What I received was an envelope delivered to my home. Inside was a 2-page report, and at the bottom of the final page was a signature." She fell silent for a long moment. "They didn't prosecute me. Do you understand that part? There wasn't enough evidence to prosecute, but there was enough to suspend my license. That meant I was never declared innocent, and I was never put on trial. I was simply placed outside, the door closed, and no one had to explain anything to me." She turned and looked at him for the first time since she had begun speaking. "They didn't need to prove I was guilty. They only needed a name to write on the report." Elias remained still. In more than 10 years, he had listened to hundreds of people tell him their stories, and every one of those stories ended in the same way, with a request, a number, a name that needed to be handled, something he could either grant or refuse. He had built his entire life on the principle that human loyalty could be bought, and that price was only a matter of time. The woman sitting 1 step away from him had just told him how she had lost everything, and she wasn't asking for anything. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't mention the thick envelope a man had placed on the counter of her laundromat with both hands. She told the story, and then she stopped, as though she had set down something heavy on the ground, and now she sat staring into the empty space between the buildings, breathing out a white cloud into the cold air. "I'm telling you this because you'll be leaving," she said. "It's easier to tell things to someone who's about to go." He looked at the side of her face in the gray morning light, and for the first time in his life, Elias Marchetti didn't know what he was supposed to say. She sat there a little longer, then rose, brushed the snow from the hem of her coat, and said she had to open the laundromat because the regular customers began arriving early in the morning. She worked the entire day as she always did, taking in laundry, writing receipts, counting loose change, while Elias sat in the corner watching her, watching the way she lowered her head and thanked every person who walked out the door even when they had paid to wash only 4 pounds of clothes. In the afternoon, when the laundromat was quiet, she disappeared for about 20 minutes. He heard the front door close, then open again. When she returned, she walked straight into the storage room, removed her coat, and draped it over the back of the chair, then placed a brown paper envelope on top of the detergent box, the kind of envelope banks handed out at the counter. He looked at it, then at her. "What is this?" 2,800. She spoke quickly, like someone who had practiced the sentence on the walk back. "Take it. Buy a bus ticket out of the city. Go anywhere. The farther the better. And the first thing you do when you get there is find a clinic and have someone look at those stitches again. My 4 stitches will only hold you until then. The rest needs antibiotics, and I'm not allowed to prescribe anything for anyone anymore." Elias didn't reach for it. He stared at the envelope lying on the detergent box lid between streaks of dried soap, and something inside his chest cracked so quietly that he couldn't stop it in time. "What money is this?" She was silent for a moment. Then she answered, and when she did, she looked directly at him, without turning away. "The deposit for a 2-bedroom apartment in the building at the top of the street. I saved for 2 years. The place I live in now has only 1 bedroom. The boy sleeps in the bedroom and I sleep on the couch outside. And that's all right, but he's growing fast, and I kept thinking about the day he might have a door of his own to close when he wants to." She gave the slightest shrug, as though she were speaking about the weather. "The apartment will still be there. I'll save again." The man who had once ordered transfers of sums an entire neighborhood couldn't earn in a lifetime, the man with accounts under different names in 3 countries, and a locked room in a Back Bay building filled with things he couldn't even remember, sat motionless on the wooden chair and couldn't speak a single word. He had watched people kneel for money. He had watched them betray one another for numbers far smaller than this. He had never seen anyone place before a stranger the exact thing it had taken them 2 years to save, then simply shrug. "You don't know who I am," he said. "No," she replied. "And this morning, you weren't planning to tell me. You saw what happened yesterday in this laundromat." "I did." She pulled the plastic chair closer and sat down, both hands clasped together on her knees. "I saw a man without shoes sitting in the corner say 3 sentences, and a man half again his size ran out of here as if he had been burned. I thought about it all night while I was at work, and I still decided to do this." He looked at her. "Why?" She was silent longer than he expected. "Because 3 years ago, I was sitting in a dark place like that alley outside. Not literally, but I sat there for a long time, and I remember very clearly how many people walked past." She lowered her eyes. "People aren't cruel, they're just busy. Everyone is busy. And every time another person walks by, the thought in your head grows a little larger, the thought that maybe you deserve what happened to you." She looked up. "I don't want to be the person who walks past, that's all." Then she pushed the envelope a little farther toward him. "I believe there will be a day when you can stand up again. I don't know how, and I don't know when, but when that day comes, I'll be glad I didn't step over you." Elias reached out. He placed his hand on the envelope and left it there, neither picking it up nor pushing it back. He remained that way for a long time, long enough for her to begin finding it strange, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough in the way of someone who had swallowed something too hot. "Delaney." It was the first time he had called her by name. "Leave it there for now." She nodded, stood, put on her coat, and went outside to open the front door for an elderly woman who had just knocked on the glass. Left alone in the storage room, Elias looked at the brown paper envelope beneath his palm and thought of all the people who had sworn loyalty to him in rooms with high ceilings, and he understood that not one of them had ever given him something they truly needed. The video had begun spreading the night before, in the way things spread when people watch them while waiting for a train. 14 seconds long, filmed vertically, shaky, with the sound of wind mixed with laughter. And the caption someone had placed beneath it said that the homeless man in the alley looked exactly like the crime boss who had just burned to death at the harbor. Delaney saw it in the middle of the morning, when a young customer waiting to collect her clothes held her phone across the counter and told her to watch it for a laugh. The first time, Delaney didn't recognize anything, because the face in the frame was blurred by the camera light shining directly into it, and because that alley looked like every other alley in the city. She watched it a second time because the young woman insisted. At the 11th second, the person filming stepped back half a pace to take in the whole scene, and the camera swept lower, and in that exact moment, Delaney saw 2 bare feet resting on pavement, covered with salt. She went completely still. She was still holding someone else's phone, her thumb resting on the screen, and she rewound it, then rewound it again, and the third time she froze the image at that exact moment. For 2 years, she had stood in a small kitchen every Sunday night, polishing that leather. She knew the worn place where the boots creased across the top of the foot. She knew the left side was more worn than the right, because Wyatt had always shifted his weight to one side when he stood for too long. She handed the phone back to the customer, thanked her, passed over the bag of clothes, and waited until the doorbell had gone completely silent before placing both hands on the counter. In that video, the man in her storage room wasn't wearing shoes. That meant the footage had been recorded before the day she opened the metal trunk. It meant someone had already stood in front of him, shone a light into his face, and called out his name before she had even known he existed. And now that video was playing on phones all across the city. She lifted her eyes toward the partly closed storage room door, and for the first time in several days, what rose inside her wasn't curiosity but a very specific fear. The fear of someone who had just understood that somebody was searching, and they were about to find what they were looking for. Across the city, in a room with high ceilings and a glass wall overlooking the bay, Ambrose Keene watched the same video on a large screen. He watched it once, then told them to play it again. He sat perfectly still, both hands clasped over his stomach, his thin framed glasses slipping slightly down the bridge of his nose. On the third viewing, he told them to stop at the 9th second. "You see this part?" he said to the man standing beside him, his voice gentle, almost instructional. They're laughing in his face, but he doesn't lift his head. He doesn't argue, doesn't cover his face, doesn't walk away. He removed his glasses, wiped them with the edge of his handkerchief, then put them back on. A man who's about to die panics. A man who's waiting sits still. Then he rose, walked to the glass wall, and delivered the final sentence in the voice of someone who had just realized he had placed the wrong chess piece 3 moves earlier. "Find me that alley, and find out which businesses within 1 block open early." That afternoon, a black sedan stopped in front of the laundromat, and Preston Vance stepped inside carrying the scent of expensive cologne and a slim leather briefcase. He had brought no laundry. He placed the case on the counter, opened the locks, and took out a stapled set of papers and a small velvet box. Then he turned the papers so she could read them. 71,000. All of it, he said. Not deferred, not divided into payments. Erased. "My signature is already on the last page. The only one missing is yours." He pushed the velvet box toward her, and the way he looked at her made Delaney step back half a pace and fold her arms across her chest before she had time to think. "You won't have to work night shifts anymore. You won't have to stand behind this counter anymore." She looked down at the papers, then pushed them back toward him. Not hard, only enough to slide them beyond the invisible line between them. "Thank you. I'm not signing." Preston didn't become angry. He smiled, and he closed the briefcase with the unhurried movement of a man who had plenty of time. "Do you know who owns the building you rent?" he asked. "That entire row, including the space you're standing in right now. I bought it last fall." He picked up the velvet box, turned it once in his hand, then slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. "And you know how it is. There aren't many people in the medical profession in this state. Everyone knows everyone. A letter of recommendation is only a piece of paper, but whether someone signs it is another matter." He tapped 2 fingers very lightly against the counter. "Think about it. I'm in no hurry." Then he walked out. Delaney remained exactly where she was, both arms still folded across her chest, until the sound of the car outside had faded completely. In the storage room, behind the partly closed door, the man sitting on the wooden chair had heard every word. Beverly Cole arrived the next morning, and she came with the video already open on her phone, holding it up at her daughter's eye level the moment she crossed the threshold. Everyone in this neighborhood has been sending me this. 3 people, Delaney, 3 different people in one morning. At the time, there were 2 regular customers waiting for their dryers, and an elderly man sitting on the plastic chair beside the window. Delaney set down the stack of towels. "Could you lower your voice, Mom? Lower my voice?" Beverly gave a short laugh, the laugh of someone who had held back for long enough. "You're hiding a man in the storage room behind this laundromat, a man people filmed out on the street, a man nobody knows anything about, and you're telling me to lower my voice." She placed the phone on the counter. "For 3 years, I haven't dared go to church on Sunday. Do you know why? Because I can't stand the way people fall silent when I walk in. Well, now they've got something new to talk about." Delaney stood still. "Are you finished?" "No." Beverly drew in a breath. "I raised you for 18 years so you could study for that profession. I sat in the kitchen counting every dollar so you could have your first uniform. Then they took that profession away from you, and I endured that too. I told myself that was simply your fate. But now you've brought a homeless man into the place where you earn your living, and I have to say something. I have to say it because there's no one left who will say it to you." She lifted one hand as though she meant to continue, then stopped in the middle of the sentence. Her hand froze in the air. The fingers slightly spread, and something passed very quickly across her face. She blinked twice. She reached for the edge of the counter but missed it by several inches, and then she collapsed. Someone in the laundromat screamed. One of the women rushed forward, dropped to her knees, wrapped both arms around Beverly's shoulders, and held tightly to her upper arms while shouting her name again and again, as though she might be able to call her back. The other woman ran behind the counter, searched through a drawer, found a spoon, and came back with her hands trembling, saying they had to put it in Beverly's mouth or she would bite her tongue. The elderly man by the window stood up but didn't know what to do. He only remained there with his hat in his hands. The storage room door flew open. Elias crossed the laundromat in only a few strides, and the first thing he did was knock aside the hand holding the spoon, firmly, without saying a word. The second thing he did was pull away the woman gripping Beverly's shoulders and move her back. "Don't hold her down. Let go. Nobody puts anything in her mouth." He kicked the plastic chair and the nearby laundry basket out of the way, clearing the space around Beverly's body. Then he supported her shoulder and hip, rolled her onto her side, tilted her head slightly back, and placed his coat beneath it. He looked up at the elderly man standing frozen in place. "Call an ambulance. Give them the laundromat's exact address and tell them she's unconscious." Then he turned to Delaney, and his voice didn't rise at all. "Where is her handbag?" Delaney had already dropped to her knees on the other side, and she seized the bag that had fallen beside the counter. Her hands searched past the wallet, the keys, and a tin of mint cigarettes, until she pulled out a small orange tube of gel, the squeeze kind, crushed inward at the center. She looked at it, and for 1 second the world seemed to fall away beneath her. "My mother has diabetes. She hid it from me," she said, and she heard her own voice break on the final word. "She's been hiding it from me for a year." Elias took the tube, turned Beverly's head a little farther to the side, and squeezed a small amount of gel against the inside of her cheek, between the gum and the flesh. Then he gently rubbed the outside of her cheek to help it dissolve. He didn't pour anything into her mouth. He didn't lift her and try to force her to drink. He only performed that one precise action, then shifted back half a step, keeping one hand on her shoulder so she wouldn't roll out of the recovery position. His eyes fixed on the clock above the door. The entire laundromat went silent. The woman who had been holding the spoon stood against a washing machine, with both hands covering her mouth. The elderly man repeated the address into the phone for the second time, slowly and clearly. Delaney knelt there, holding her mother's hand, cold and damp in her own, and she didn't take her eyes from Beverly's face for even a second. Then Beverly's eyelids moved. She released a long breath. She opened her eyes, looked up at the ceiling, then glanced around without understanding where she was, and the first person who came into focus was a man in an old gray sweater kneeling beside her, one hand still resting on her shoulder, his feet inside a pair of scuffed steel-toed work boots. She looked at him for a long time. In the distance, the sound of an ambulance siren was already approaching from the top of the street. Beverly ran her tongue over her lips and spoke in a rough, broken voice, but every word was clear enough for everyone in the laundromat to hear. "I owe you my life." She paused to catch her breath. "And I'm still not letting you have my daughter." The woman who entered the laundromat the following afternoon didn't look exactly like her mother, but there was enough resemblance for anyone to recognize it at once. Meredith Cole wore a wine-colored coat, her hair neatly tied back, and the first thing she did was look around the room the way someone inspected a house they were considering buying. Delaney was at the hospital with her mother. Elias was the only person left in the laundromat, sitting in the corner as he did every day. Meredith knew that. She had waited until she knew it. "You're the man who saved my mother," she said, her voice carrying precisely the right amount of warmth. "My entire family is grateful to you. We truly are. That's part of the reason I came." Elias didn't stand. "And the other part?" "The other part is harder to say." Meredith pulled the plastic chair closer and sat across from him, both hands resting on her knees, her head tilted slightly to one side. "My sister doesn't know how to bring anything to a clean end. She never has. She lets things drag on because she's afraid of hurting people. And in the end, everyone gets hurt worse." She sighed. "She asked me to come and speak to you." He said nothing. "She's already made her choice. Preston Vance. This was being discussed before you ever appeared. She simply hadn't been able to make it final." Meredith opened her handbag, took out a set of papers folded in half, smoothed them flat, and placed them on the detergent box beside him. "This is the preliminary agreement. The Harrogate property belongs to my mother and her children, so her signature was required. She signed yesterday, before she went into the hospital." Meredith turned to the final page and kept her hand there for a moment. "Go ahead and read it. I imagine that for a man like you, documents are easier to understand than words." Elias picked up the papers. He truly read them, not merely glanced over them, and he stopped at the last page. The signature there was written in blue ink, slanting to the right, with a broad loop in the first letter and a long stroke trailing from the last. Beneath it, the name Beverly Ann Cole had been printed in the careful handwriting of an older woman. He stared at it for a long time. His entire life had been built on documents. He had learned very early that words were the cheapest thing in the city, that people could swear anything inside a room, then step outside and forget every promise they had made. But a signature remained. A signature carried a date, a witness, and consequences. He had lived by that principle for 10 years, and it had never betrayed him. He folded the papers in half along the original crease. "Did she say anything else?" "She said you shouldn't wait for her here anymore." Meredith stood and straightened the hem of her coat. "She also said you've already taken her money, so I suppose you have some way to leave." She said it softly, almost regretfully, then walked toward the door. At the threshold, she paused and looked back at him once more with the expression of someone who had completed a difficult but necessary task. The doorbell chimed. Elias remained alone with the papers in his hands. Beyond the glass, the sky was growing dark, and cars passed with their headlights stretched into bands of yellow. He didn't feel angry. He felt something far stranger, the feeling of a man who had missed a stair he had climbed thousands of times, and for the first time in many years, he sat there without knowing whom he should believe. That night, he called Hollis, not to ask about Meredith, and not to ask about Delaney. He asked about the property. He wanted to know exactly who owned what along the Harrogate strip that Preston Vance had been buying since the previous fall, parcel by parcel, quietly, and why a man who had purchased an entire row of buildings still had to sit inside a laundromat and push a debt cancellation agreement toward a woman who worked nights. Hollis needed 2 days. Then he arrived, placed a file of copied records from the registry office before his employer, and opened it to the exact page that mattered. "The corner parcel, sir. The piece sitting directly between the two halves of the development. Without it, they can't connect the access road." Elias lowered his eyes and read. "The former owner was a man named Ellis Cole. He died years ago. The property passed to his son, and that son was Wyatt Cole." Hollis paused. "He left a handwritten will about 4 years ago. His share was transferred to his wife. All of it. The paperwork was completed before his death. The only sound in the storage room was the rattling heater." "It isn't large," Hollis continued. "Only about 1/8 of the entire parcel. But it lies in exactly the wrong place. So if she refuses to sign, Vance's whole development stops. It doesn't slow down. It stops completely." Elias didn't answer. He sat looking down at the page, at the name Delaney Marie Cole printed in the column marked Current Owner, and in his mind he saw clearly the woman counting loose change in the tray behind the counter, smoothing each crumpled bill, and writing the total in her blue-covered ledger at the end of every day. She was sitting on the very thing half the city was fighting to possess, and she had no idea. He closed the file, placed it on top of the agreement bearing the signature, and said nothing. Delaney reached the laundromat after the street had gone quiet, carrying a bag of things she had brought back from the hospital, and she was surprised to find every light inside turned off and the front door locked from within. She went around to the back. The storage room door was already open, and Elias was standing there with his coat on, not sitting in the wooden chair as he did every evening. 2 cars have been parked at the top of the street since dusk, he said. No license plates. They've gone into 3 stores, asked the same question, and the 3rd store was the cafe across from here. She stopped on the step. What did they ask? Whether anyone saw a barefoot man on the day it snowed. He looked into the darkness of the alley. Someone answered them. It isn't their fault. They only told the truth. Delaney set down the bag. Then you need to go. You're coming with me, he said, in a voice that left no room for negotiation. Someone saw you standing in the doorway with me this morning. If I disappear and you stay, you'll be the only person they can find. She opened her mouth to argue, then heard a car door close at the top of the street. Not loudly, only one clean click, and she fell silent. They left through the back, cut across the rear courtyards of the row houses, and then they ran. The pavement was covered in a thin layer of ice that had been crushed underfoot during the day and frozen again into something uneven and slick. She ran behind him, one hand holding the hem of her coat, her breath breaking into white bursts. Footsteps followed behind them, not hurried, steady, the rhythm of people who knew they had more time than those who were running. They turned into the fish market that had closed hours earlier, long rows of empty stainless steel counters stretching away on either side, the floor still wet, the cold and the smell of salt clinging to the throat with every breath. Elias pulled her sharply behind a concrete pillar and pressed her into stillness. The footsteps passed about 13 feet away. Then they stopped. Then they separated in 2 directions. He caught her wrist and pulled her onward without speaking, and they reached the market's rear exit, where an iron fire escape climbed the side of the old building next door. She went first. Her shoes struck the metal steps with a sound so loud that even she winced, one hard clang after another, loud enough for the entire building to hear, and somewhere below, someone looked up and shouted once. At the 2nd floor landing, her foot slipped. She missed only half a step, but that was enough, and as she staggered, a hand reached up from below, seized her wrist, tightened, and pulled downward. She cried out. What happened next was something she would remember forever, not because it lasted, but because it was over so quickly. Elias turned back. He didn't shout. He didn't say a word. He came down 4 steps in less than a breath, and the hand released her wrist. Then there was the sound of a body striking the iron railing. Once, twice, and the man was already lying on the landing before anyone could understand how it had happened. Delaney stood gripping the railing and looked down. Elias was there, his back slightly bent, one hand still twisted into the man's collar, and he didn't stop. That was what made the cold move through her. Not the speed, the fact that he didn't stop. Beneath the dull yellow light of the security lamp mounted on the wall, she saw his face, and there was no anger in it, no urgency, nothing at all, only a flat and absolute concentration, the expression of a man performing familiar work. "Sir," a voice called from the courtyard below. Hollis was there, though she had no idea when he had arrived, and he charged up the stairs, grabbed his employer by both shoulders, and pulled him sharply backward. "Sir." Elias didn't move. "Sir, stop." Hollis said it a second time close to his ear, his voice urgent but held low. "You already gave the order, this neighborhood. You gave that order yourself." A silence lasted for exactly 2 beats. Then Elias let go. He straightened, adjusted the collar of his coat with one slow movement, and released a long breath. The man at his feet crawled away. He didn't dare stand. He dragged himself down several steps before he managed to run. Hollis said something into the radio clipped inside his collar. In the courtyard below, 2 other figures were already backing toward the alley entrance. Elias looked up at the 2nd floor landing. Delaney was still standing there, one hand gripping the railing, the other holding the wrist that had just been crushed. She didn't step back. She didn't move toward him either. She only looked at him, and that look was unlike any look he had received in 10 years, because it didn't hold fear in the way people usually feared him. It held something else, the look of someone who had opened the wrong door and seen everything waiting on the other side. He climbed toward her. At the final step, he stopped at a distance and lowered his eyes to her wrist. "Does it hurt?" She didn't answer. She looked at him for a long while longer, then turned away and continued climbing to the 3rd floor alone. Hollis took them to an empty apartment on the 5th floor of an old building on the north side of the city. The kind of apartment that had furniture but had never truly been lived in, and he left the key before going. Delaney sat on the edge of the sofa for nearly an hour, still wearing her coat, rubbing her wrist over and over even though it had stopped hurting long ago. She had called Ruth Halloran twice, and both times Ruth told her the boy had finished his entire bowl of soup, gone to sleep early, and still had his nightlight on, so there was nothing to worry about. Elias stood by the window without turning on the main lights. "Are you going to tell me now?" she asked. He didn't turn around. "Not yet. Then I'll ask something else." She rose and walked to the middle of the room. 3 years ago, someone signed a piece of paper that took my profession away from me, and I didn't know who that person was until this week. Today, several men came looking for you in my neighborhood, and they managed to put their hands on me. She stopped there and let those 2 sentences remain beside each other in the air for a long while. "I don't know who you are, but I know you're someone who can find things that people like me can't." Then she opened her handbag and took out an old set of papers, the edges yellowed, folded in half, and held together with a rubber band. She placed it on the table. "I've kept this for 3 years. It's a copy of my husband's accident report. They sent it to me as part of the procedure, along with a form I had to sign to receive the benefits." She looked down at the papers. "I took it to 4 places: the Labor Department, a lawyer, a reporter, and someone from the Harbor Union. The first told me the case was closed. The second told me I didn't have enough money to follow it through. The third took it and never called me back. The fourth arranged to meet me at a cafe and never showed up." She lifted her eyes. No one read the whole thing. Everyone turned past the first page and stopped. Elias looked at the papers. "Why give it to me?" "Because there's no one else left to give it to," she said. "And because you're the only person I've ever seen read a document from beginning to end without looking at the clock." She lifted her bag onto her shoulder. "I have to get back to the boy. I'll return tomorrow morning to collect it." The door closed. Elias sat down at the table, removed the rubber band, and opened the papers beneath the single desk lamp still burning in the apartment. He read them the way he read everything, from top to bottom, skipping nothing, not even the small print at the bottom of the pages. The first page was a standard report form from the Labor Oversight Agency. The second was a description of the scene, written in the kind of administrative language that had stripped away anything that might make a reader stop. The third page was a list of employees present during the shift, and on the 9th line were the 3 words, Wyatt Allen Cole, followed by an employee number, and the number of hours he had worked at the time the report was made. The 4th page contained the conclusion: no system failure, no recommendation for further investigation, case closure advised. And in the lower right corner of the final page, in the section reserved for the operating representative's confirmation, there was a signature in black ink. Small, neat, evenly slanted, the handwriting of someone who wrote so often he no longer had to think about it. Beneath the signature was a typed line: Ambrose Keene, Senior Advisor, Sable Point Group. Elias didn't move. He sat motionless beneath the desk lamp, one hand still resting on the edge of the page, and he read the line 3 times, not because he failed to understand it, but because some part of him still wanted to find another way to read it. That harbor belonged to him. That night shift had been his shift. The man who had signed the paper closing the case was the man Elias had raised up, trusted, and shared Sunday dinners with for nearly 10 years. And the name on the 9th line of the 3rd page belonged to the husband of the woman who had taken the scarf from her own neck and wrapped it around his bare feet in a snow-filled alley. He remembered the boots placed on the concrete floor, both toes pointing toward him. He remembered the words, "My husband doesn't need them anymore." The hallway light came on. There were 2 short knocks at the door, and Hollis entered carrying a paper bag of food and a printed list of the vehicles he had managed to trace. He set both down, then looked up and saw that his employer hadn't moved. "Sir." Elias didn't look up. He turned the final page around and pushed it across the table toward him, stopping exactly where the signature appeared. Hollis bent down and looked. He read the name. Then he read the name on the 3rd page, which Elias had already opened beside it. His expression didn't change, but something very small passed across it. Something an ordinary person wouldn't have noticed. Elias raised his head. He looked directly at the man who had walked behind him for nearly 10 years, and he asked only one question. "Were you there that night?" Hollis didn't answer. The following morning, the Sable Point building on Back Bay Avenue received an internal call from a number that hadn't been active for several days, and 30 minutes later, 12 people were summoned to the conference room on the highest floor without being told why. All 12 came. They came early. That was the first thing worth noting, because for the past 10 days, not one of them had agreed to meet with anyone. The room had a glass wall running its entire length, and from there the whole bay spread out below in the color of lead beneath the February sky. The conference table was long, made of dark wood, and polished so highly that people could see their own reflections in it. 12 chairs were occupied. The chair at the head of the table remained empty. They sat there waiting, and they waited in silence, because no one wanted to be the first to speak in a room when none of them understood why they had been called there. The door opened. Elias entered alone. Hollis remained outside and closed the door behind his employer. Elias wore the old gray sweater and the trousers worn thin at the knees, with no tie and no coat, and in a room filled with people dressed in tailored clothing, that plainness didn't make him seem smaller. It made everything else in the room seem smaller instead. Chairs shifted. One man sprang to his feet, then immediately sat back down. The silver-haired man seated near the far end of the table watched Elias as he walked the length of the room, and for a single moment his gaze slipped down to Elias's feet before jerking away, like someone who had looked at something he wasn't supposed to see. Elias didn't sit in the chair at the head of the table. He pulled it out, stood behind it, placed both hands on the backrest, and looked slowly around the table, one person at a time, pausing on each face just long enough for that person to know he had been seen. No one spoke. "The entire city thinks I'm dead," he said. "You thought so too. Someone went out to dinner to celebrate it, and I don't intend to ask who. Still, no one said anything. I'm not going to ask why you changed sides either. That question is for people who still believe human loyalty needs a reason." He lifted one hand from the chair and placed it on the wooden table. "I'm only going to ask you one thing. Have any of you signed anything yet?" The entire table went silent. Someone swallowed. Another person raised a hand to adjust his collar for no reason at all. The woman seated third from the left placed her pen on the table and kept her hand there, afraid to pull it back. Elias waited. He waited longer than was comfortable, long enough for the sound of the ventilation system overhead to become audible, and throughout that silence, he didn't repeat the question even once. Then a chair scraped backward. The silver-haired man stood, closed the file in front of him, and walked toward the door without looking at anyone. 2 others rose after him, almost at the same time, and one of them even left his telephone on the table. The door opened and closed 3 times. None of the 3 said a word, and none of the 9 who remained turned to watch them leave. Elias looked at the 3 empty chairs, then pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. "The rest of you are staying," he said, his voice still even. "Then get to work. I want every file from the past 3 weeks, both the ones already sent out and the ones still waiting for signatures, and I want them before nightfall." No one asked a question. 9 pens were uncapped almost in the same instant. Beyond the glass wall, the bay remained still beneath the lead-colored sky, and inside that room, the man who had just returned from the dead sat at the head of the table with both hands resting on the wood, never raising his voice once during the entire meeting, while not one person dared lift their eyes and look directly at him until he stood and walked out. The public hearing on the Harrogate redevelopment plan was held in the Community Library Auditorium at the end of Bowen Street, the kind of room with metal folding chairs arranged in 6 rows and a projection screen pulled down over half the front wall. More people came than expected, most of them neighborhood residents, small business owners, longtime tenants, people who hadn't come to speak but to hear when they would be told to leave. Preston Vance stood at the podium with a carefully prepared slide presentation. Architectural renderings of glass buildings, stone walkways, and rows of trees drawn over the place where the bus stop stood now. Meredith stood beside him holding a spare microphone, wearing her wine-colored coat, smiling at the right moments and nodding at the right moments. Beverly Cole sat in the front row, one hand resting on the handbag in her lap, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the stage. "Acquisition notices will be sent to every household within 4 weeks, Preston said. "Compensation according to the established schedule, along with relocation assistance. I know many people here have lived in this neighborhood their entire lives, and I respect that. But this neighborhood is dying, ladies and gentlemen. I didn't kill it. I only arrived afterward." A murmur passed through the room. Someone applauded. When the public comment portion began, the third person to raise a hand was Delaney. She stood in the fourth row and spoke without notes. You just said the properties would be acquired according to the established schedule. So can you state clearly, in front of everyone here, what percentage of the corner parcel you actually own, and who owns the rest? Preston smiled. Miss Cole, this is a planning hearing, not an accounting review. This is a hearing about whether 40 households are going to be forced to move, she replied. And if you haven't acquired all the land, then everything you just projected onto that wall is still nothing more than a drawing. The entire room went quiet. Preston looked down at her for a moment, then glanced toward the side of the stage. The lights dimmed. The architectural rendering disappeared from the screen, replaced by a blurry vertical frame, shaking inside a narrow alley between two brick walls. A platinum-haired woman stepped onto the stage holding a microphone, and Camille adjusted the collar of her camel-colored coat before speaking. I apologize for the interruption, but I think that before everyone listens to Miss Cole speak about morality, they should know who she has been living with. The video played. 14 seconds. Wind, laughter, the camera light shining directly into the face of a man sitting on the ground in a dark corner. Camille let it run to the end, then froze the image on the final second. This is the man she chose. The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough people. And the laughter spread the way laughter always spreads through a crowd. One person laughing because another person had laughed first. Meredith lowered her eyes to the microphone in her hand. Beverly remained still in the front row, both hands tightening around her handbag. Delaney stayed on her feet. She didn't sit down. She didn't look at the screen. She looked directly at Camille and waited until the laughter had faded enough for her voice to be heard. Yes, she said. That's him. The laughter stopped completely. You recorded 14 seconds one morning, she continued, her voice not loud but perfectly clear. I stood 3 steps away, and I saw a man who was about to lose several toes. I didn't know who he was. I still don't. But I know what happens to a person when an entire street walks past, and no one stops, because 3 years ago, I sat in a place like that too. A metal chair scraped at the back of the room. Someone had stood up. People began turning their heads toward the rear. She gave me an envelope. The voice came from the final row. Not loud, but the whole auditorium heard it. The man in the old gray sweater rose from his chair and began walking slowly up the center aisle. There were $2,800 inside. It was the entire apartment deposit she had spent 2 years saving. He reached the 4th row and stopped. She gave me everything she had when she believed I had nothing. Preston narrowed his eyes from the stage. Who are you to speak here? Elias didn't answer him. At that moment, the double doors at the back of the auditorium opened, and 4 people entered, 3 men and 1 woman, all wearing long wool coats, none of them looking toward the stage. The first was the chairman of the Boston Port Authority, a man half the people in the room had only ever seen in newspapers. Behind him came the chief executive officer of Sable Point Group. They walked to the middle of the aisle, stopped in front of the man wearing the worn steel-toed work boots, and the chairman of the Port Authority bowed his head. Mr. Marchetti. No one heard another metal chair scrape. In the 2nd row, close to the aisle, a man with salt and pepper hair wearing a wool coat rose and then sat down again, and the movement was so awkward that several people beside him turned to look. Garrett Shaw had come to the hearing as a representative of Sable Point Rehabilitation Center and was seated in the section reserved for invited guests, holding the folder he had prepared for a statement in support of the project. He had been sitting there for the past 40 minutes without once turning to look toward the final row. Now he looked, and what he saw was the man whose portrait hung in the boardroom of the building where he worked. The man whose name was engraved on the brass plaque in the lobby, the man he had still referred to in meetings the week before with the phrase, senior leadership. Elias didn't look at him. He walked to the front of the auditorium, and the chief executive officer of Sable Point followed behind and handed him a thin file. Elias took it, stepped onto the stage, and placed it on the table beside the projector, in the exact spot where Preston had been standing. Before the board votes on anything tonight, I have 2 documents I want entered into the record. He opened the file. The first document is an extract from the access log for the controlled medication cabinet in the surgical department at St. Aubin Hospital on the night the inventory discrepancy occurred 3 years ago. The original is stored in the electronic archive, not in a paper ledger, and it records every time the cabinet was opened, together with the personnel identification code used. He turned to the second page. That night, the cabinet was opened 4 times. The first 3 entries carried 2 valid signatures. The fourth carried only 1 code, and that code didn't belong to anyone assigned to the department that night. He raised his eyes and looked across the auditorium. It belonged to a member of the Professional Licensing Review Board, who was present at the hospital as a guest of the administration. The room was so silent that the projector fan could be heard. The second document is a notarized statement from Miss Fannis, Nadine Prescott, the head nurse on the surgical night shift at the time. She is retired now and lives in Vermont. She states that she reported the matter verbally to her superior within 48 hours and was instructed not to put it in writing. Elias rested one hand on the papers. The man who opened the cabinet that night was Mr. Garrett Shaw. A sound came from the second row. No one turned around, because every eye remained fixed on the stage. And this is the part that took me the longest to understand, he continued, more slowly. A man in that position doesn't simply decide to do something like this to harm a night shift nurse he has never met. Someone had to ask him. He turned to the final page. 9 months before that night, a harbor worker named Wyatt Allen Cole died during his shift, and the case was closed with the signature of Ambrose Keene, senior advisor to Sable Point Group. He paused. Mr. Cole's widow didn't accept that conclusion. Over the next 6 months, she took copies of the file to 4 places: the Labor Department, a law office, a newspaper, and the Harbor Union. Elias looked toward the 4th row. 9 months later, her professional license was suspended because of a report she had never been permitted to attend or read. From that day forward, if she said anything about her husband's death, the first thing anyone saw in her record was the suspension. He closed the file. They didn't need her to remain silent. They only needed to make sure no one believed her anymore. No one in the auditorium moved. In the front row, Beverly Cole slowly lifted one hand to cover her mouth. Preston Vance stood beside the stage, staring down at the floor. Meredith placed the spare microphone on the table so gently that it was clear she was afraid it might make a sound. Elias turned toward the second row, where Garrett Shaw remained seated with the folder still resting untouched across his lap. Mr. Shaw, you will submit your resignation before this building closes tonight, he said. This entire file was sent to the State Medical Board and the District Attorney's Office this afternoon, so what happens next is no longer within my authority. He turned away. You would be wise to remain seated. And in the 4th row, the woman who had been standing all this time said nothing. She didn't cry out. She didn't ask him to repeat anything. She only lowered herself slowly onto the metal folding chair behind her, placed both hands in her lap, and bowed her head. Her shoulders began to shake. For 3 years, she had stood in rooms far worse than this one without shedding a single tear. She had signed for a metal trunk without shedding one. She had listened to people speak about her behind her back at the grocery store without shedding one. The woman seated beside her, an elderly neighbor from the row of houses across from the laundromat, quietly placed a hand on her back. And Delaney Cole wept for the first time since the morning they lowered her husband into the earth. People left without knowing what to say to one another, and the board announced that the vote would be postponed until the next session. Preston Vance went out through the side door with 2 attorneys. Camille remained beside the projector for a while. Then she left as well. Delaney stayed seated in the folding chair in the 4th row until the auditorium was almost completely empty, and when she finally stood, only the elderly neighbor, her mother, and the man still waiting at the end of the aisle remained. They reached the parking lot behind the library, where only a few tall lights were still burning and a thin layer of ice covered the pavement. Garrett Shaw was waiting there. He had left his folder somewhere inside. His tie was loosened, and he walked straight over to block Elias's path with the reckless look of a man who had realized he had nothing left to lose that night. You don't understand what happened, he said, his voice rising. I did that because I was told to do it. And the man who told me is still sitting in there while I'm standing out here. He reached out and seized the front of Elias's sweater. You can't cast me out there alone. Everything happened very quickly. Hollis rushed in from behind the car, and during the struggle all 3 men lost their balance on the ice. Elias slipped. His knee struck the pavement, and his left foot slammed hard against the edge of the concrete step bordering the parking lot. There was a very soft, clean crack, like an old thread snapping. Hollis pulled Garrett away. Elias stood, and he realized that his left step felt strangely loose. He looked down. The outer sole of the left boot had separated from the body of the shoe for a length of almost 4 inches. exposing the lining inside. And in that opening was something that didn't belong in any shoe in the world. A small plastic packet, folded into thirds, yellowed with age, sewn into the lining with black cord, the clumsy stitching of someone sewing by hand in a hurry. Delaney stepped closer. She looked down. She recognized those stitches before she had time to think, because she had seen them everywhere in her home, on the strap of a bag, across a tear in the kitchen curtain, on the sofa cushion he had mended, and then told her would hold for now. Elias sat on the concrete step, untied the boot, and used his key to pry away the last part of the sole still attached. He pulled out the remaining stitches. The plastic packet fell into his palm. He handed it to her without opening it. Standing beneath the tall parking lot light, Delaney peeled away each layer of plastic with fingers that no longer obeyed her. Inside were two things: a small, dark blue memory card, the kind used in industrial recording equipment, and a sheet of paper folded into quarters, torn from a shift logbook, with the marks from the spiral binding still along one edge. She opened it. The handwriting slanted to the right, written in ballpoint pen with heavy pressure, and in one place the paper had torn because he had been writing too quickly. Dell, I copied everything. Tomorrow morning I'm handing in my resignation, and we'll start over. Tell the boy his father is coming home. There was nothing else. No signature, no date, only those 4 lines and a blank space beneath them that he had never had the chance to fill. Delaney stood motionless for a long time. Then her knees gave way, and she sank onto the icy pavement of the parking lot, holding the paper in both hands, reading it a second time, a third, a fourth. For 3 years, she had lived with a question she had never dared speak aloud to anyone. The question of what her husband had been thinking during the final hours of his life. Whether he had time to be afraid, whether he had time to remember her and their son. And now she knew. He had been thinking about coming home. He had been thinking about the next morning. Somewhere at the harbor during his night shift, he had threaded a needle through the lining of his boot sole with the black cord he always kept in his toolbox, and he had believed that all he had to do was make it through that one night, and everything would be over. He had been only 1 night away. Beverly Cole knelt beside her daughter on the ice without saying anything, only wrapping one arm around her shoulders, while the elderly neighbor stood behind them and raised a hand to shield them from the wind. Elias remained seated on the concrete step with the boot whose sole had come apart resting in his hands. He looked at the opening in the lining, at the few black stitches still clinging there, and in his mind every day came back to him with perfect clarity. The morning in the storage room when he tied the laces for the first time and realized the boots fit. The night in the alley when he pushed the new shoebox aside and said he would wear this pair until the work was finished. The glance of the silver-haired man in the conference room high above the city, looking down at his feet before quickly turning his eyes away. All those days, the thing Ambrose Keene and every man working for him had been searching for had been resting directly beneath Elias's feet, passing through the harbor, through the Back Bay building, through the conference room with the glass wall overlooking the bay. He had carried it with him the entire way without ever knowing. And the person who had placed it in his hands on the coldest morning of that winter was the woman now sitting on the ice only a few steps away from him. They took Beverly home first. Then Hollis drove Delaney back to Harrogate, and Elias sat beside her in the back seat for the entire ride without anyone speaking a word. When they stopped in front of her building, she didn't get out right away. She remained there with the note still held between her fingers, staring through the window for a long time. "The name on the accident report," she said. "The man who signed the paper closing my husband's case. Tonight, you read it aloud in front of the entire auditorium." Elias didn't answer. "Ambrose Keene, Senior Advisor to Sable Point Group." She turned toward him. "Tonight, they called you Mr. Marchetti." The car was very quiet. Hollis sat in the front with both hands resting on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed straight ahead. "I gave you that file several days ago," she continued, and her voice was so even that its calmness was what made it frightening. "You picked it up, you read it, and the next morning you gave it back to me. You didn't say anything. You didn't ask me a single question." He remained silent. "You read the last page, didn't you?" "Yes." "You read page 3, didn't you? The list of employees on that shift." "Yes." She nodded slowly, like someone confirming the answer to a calculation she had already solved. "So for the past several days, you've known that my husband died at your harbor, during a shift managed by your people, and that the case was closed with the signature of a man you shared dinner with for nearly 10 years. She opened the car door halfway, then stopped. Were you ever going to tell me? Or were you planning to wait until you had finished handling your own business before it became my turn? Elias opened his mouth. Then he closed it again. An answer was already waiting there. An answer about needing time, about how telling her too soon would have placed her in danger, about how he hadn't yet been certain enough, and he could hear every word of it clearly in his mind. Reasonable, ordered, complete. He didn't say it, because he knew all of it was true, and none of it changed the simple fact that he had sat in her storage room eating bread after reading that name. He remained silent, and that silence was the most complete answer he had ever given in his life. Delaney stepped out of the car. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at him through the open door, and her face was completely dry now. There were no tears. There was no breaking in her voice. She had used all her tears in the library auditorium an hour earlier, and what remained now was something flat, clean, and beyond repair. That morning, I opened that trunk, she said. For 3 years, I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I sat on the floor all night before I managed to lift the lid. She drew in a breath. Then I wrapped the boots in a cloth bag, walked 3 blocks while it was still dark, opened the storage room door, and placed them in front of you. Her voice still didn't rise. You picked them up with both hands. I saw your hands trembling. I thought it was because you were moved. She stepped back once. You let me give you those boots, and you knew who they belonged to. He didn't try to stop her. That was the only thing anyone could have said about him in that moment. The man who had spent 10 years making sure nothing ever left his hands once he had decided to keep it. The man who could make one telephone call and bring an entire street to a halt within 20 minutes, remained seated in the back of the car and watched her turn away toward the entrance of the building. He didn't call her name. He didn't reach out. He offered no promise, no money, no explanation, because for the first time in his life, he understood that all those things belonged to a system she had never been part of. Delaney stopped on the front step. She didn't turn around. I still would have given them to you, she said, loudly enough for him to hear. Even if I had known everything beforehand, I still would have given them to you. Then she opened the door and went inside. The hallway light came on, then went dark. A little while later, the 3rd floor window lit up, and her shadow passed across it once before disappearing. Inside the car, Hollis kept both hands on the steering wheel. Where to, sir? Elias continued looking up at that window for a long while. Wait a little longer. And they sat silently in the car parked along Harrogate Street until the light on the 3rd floor finally went out. The following morning, Delaney didn't go to work. She took a bus downtown to the Federal District, sat in the hallway for nearly 2 hours, and eventually a man in his 50s with thinning hair invited her inside. He introduced himself as Whitaker, and he listened to her speak for 20 minutes without interrupting once, even when she placed the memory card on the desk between them. Then he leaned back in his chair. I believe you, he said, but I need to tell you something, and I'm going to tell you the truth, because you deserve the truth. He pointed at the card. This is unclaimed data. You didn't obtain it from a system. You found it inside a shoe. There's no chain of custody, no seizure record, and no witness who can verify how it was created. The attorneys on the other side would need about half a morning to have it excluded from the record. He tapped the desk twice with one finger. Unless someone with internal authority is willing to testify that what's on it is genuine, whose records they are, where they passed through, and who signed them, someone from inside the house. Delaney looked at him. How long have you been waiting for that person? Whitaker gave her a very thin smile. Much longer than 3 years, miss. Cole. She picked up the memory card and slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat. That night, warehouse number 4 at the eastern edge of the harbor was still brightly lit, because Ambrose Keene had moved his entire operation there after the hearing, and trucks carrying documents had been seen coming and going throughout the afternoon. Delaney walked through the main gate. No one stopped her, because no one knew who she was. She crossed the empty concrete yard, entered through the open rolling door, and walked to the center of the warehouse, where Keene stood beside a long table covered with file boxes, wearing thin framed glasses and a cashmere sweater with the sleeves pushed up to his elbows. She took out the memory card and placed it on the table before him. Do you know what this is? Keene looked down. His expression didn't change. He only straightened, and in that brief silence something passed through his eyes that Delaney couldn't understand, something closer to relief than fear. You're Cole's wife, he said. I've thought about you from time to time over the past 3 years. Then he reached out. What happened next unfolded in the darkness of the warehouse, between rows of boxes stacked high, and it happened quickly. Someone rushed in from the rear entrance. There were footsteps pounding across concrete, the crash of falling boxes, and the sound of a metal door slamming against a wall. Delaney was jerked backward behind a row of pallets, and someone forced her to crouch low. She recognized Hollis's hand. Every overhead light went out at once. In the darkness there was only breathing, footsteps, and the sound of something sliding a long distance across the concrete floor. Then the lights came back on. Elias stood in the middle of the warehouse, breathing hard, one shoulder of his sweater torn, while Keene sat on the floor with his back against the leg of the table, his glasses lying several feet away. None of Keene's men were still standing. The entire warehouse was silent. "What do you plan to do with that card, Elias?" Keene asked, his voice still gentle, almost instructional. "Have you watched it yet?" "I don't think you have." He gave a quiet laugh. "It doesn't contain only me. It contains everything. Every shipment, every name, every signature. And you already know whose signature is at the top. That harbor belonged to you. For 10 years it was yours." He braced one hand against the floor and sat straighter. "You turn it over, and you bring me down. But you go down with me. You don't simply lose the company. You lose everything, including your freedom." Elias remained still. "You're the man I trained," Keene continued, more gently. "Put the card down, and we'll sit together. 3 days from now, everything will be exactly as it was." Elias reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He took out a telephone, and its screen was lit, showing a call that had been connected and running for 21 minutes. He bent down and slid it across the concrete floor toward Keene's feet. "You taught me patience," he said. "I'm more patient than you are." Keene looked down at the screen. He looked at the name displayed there, and for the first time that night, his face changed. Headlights swept through the open rolling door. 3 vehicles, then 4. People entered through both entrances. Ambrose Keene was taken out of warehouse number 4 before dawn, and that same night, across the city, someone knocked on the door of Preston Vance's apartment on the 22nd floor. In the nearly empty warehouse, Delaney sat on a wooden crate with her hands still trembling, while Hollis stood several steps away, his eyes lowered to the floor. Elias walked over and sat beside him. Neither man spoke for a long while. Then Hollis began, his voice rough. "Sir, I was there that night." Elias didn't turn toward him. "I told him not to do it. I stood in the doorway." Hollis stopped. "Then he told me to go outside, and I went outside." He raised one hand and wiped it across his face. "For 3 years, I've meant to tell you every day. I couldn't do it." Elias remained still. Outside, the sky was turning the pale gray of early morning, and a ship's horn sounded across the bay, one long note, then silence. Whitaker placed the agreement on the table one afternoon near the end of the month, and he added no words of persuasion, because he understood that what lay on the table was already heavy enough to speak for itself. Surrender every file, ledger, and piece of data. Permanently dissolve the Harbor Transportation Division. Relinquish all control, both direct and indirect. Submit to financial oversight for 3 years. Hollis stood by the window and said that he didn't have to do this, that he had 4 of the finest law firms on the East Coast, that he could survive it. Elias sat motionless, the pen beside his hand, untouched. The person who entered the room then wasn't Whitaker, and it wasn't a lawyer. Delaney had returned on her own. She stood at the head of the table, looked down at the papers, then looked at him. "If you keep it, you're still the man who killed my husband," she said. "You didn't give the order. I know that. But that harbor belonged to you. That man worked for you. And the paper that closed the case carried the name of your company. If you keep it, you keep that part too." She pushed the pen closer to his hand. "If you let it go, then you become the man I met in that alley." Elias picked up the pen. He signed in all 4 marked places, and when he set it down, no one in the room said anything more. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and took out a sheet of paper folded into quarters, worn thin along the creases from being opened and folded too many times. Hollis recognized it immediately. It was the list he had placed on the snow outside the storage room on the night he found his employer, the list of 7 names, and for all those weeks he had waited for an order that never came. Elias opened it and placed it on the table in front of Whitaker. "These 7 people," he said. "Every one of them left the state before the hearing. Travel money, housing for the first 6 months, and legal documents for those who needed to change jobs. All of it has already been arranged. You'll find the transfers in the records I just surrendered." Hollis looked down at the paper, then up at his employer. And for the first time in nearly 10 years, something showed on his face. "They were the people in the room that night, sir. They heard everything. They chose to stand still." "Yes," Elias said, "and they are the only 7 people still alive who can confirm what happened. If I had left them in this city for 1 more week, none of them would still be able to speak now." He pushed the paper toward Whitaker. "You need testimony. Here are 7 witnesses." 6 months later, on an early summer morning, a small wooden sign was hung above the door of the 2-story building at the end of Harrogate Street, the place that had once been an abandoned printing shop, the Wyatt Cole Foundation. Inside were 2 classrooms, a training room equipped with models and medical equipment, and on the ground floor, a large room with benches, hot water, and places to charge telephones, open all winter to anyone who needed somewhere warm to sit. The first class had 14 students, all of them people whose professional licenses had been suspended without ever receiving a trial, people who had lived for years with a mark beside their names in a file no one had ever explained to them. The instructor was Delaney Cole, and on the wall behind her hung a simple glass frame containing her restored nursing license, stamped, signed, and clearly dated with the day it had been reissued. Beverly arrived at noon carrying a lunchbox and a bag of bread, and she stood in the classroom doorway for a long time before stepping inside. She placed the lunchbox on her daughter's desk. "I made it a little too salty," she said. "My taste hasn't been right lately." Then she remained there, turning the handle of the bag around and around in her hands. "That day at the laundromat, I said those things in front of everyone." Delaney closed the notebook on her desk. "Sit down, Mom." Beverly sat. "I'm not angry with you," Delaney said, "but I need to say this once, and then we'll be done with it. We won't bring it up again. That day, you looked at a man sitting in the storage room and saw a homeless man. Only a few minutes later, that same man was the one who kept you lying on your side in the correct position on the laundromat floor while we waited for the ambulance." She placed her hand over her mother's. "A person in torn clothes isn't worth less than anyone else, Mom. They're only living through the worst part of a story we haven't heard yet. I was once living through that part too." Beverly nodded, then wiped the corner of her eye with the back of her hand in the way women of her generation did, quickly and neatly, as though it had never happened. That afternoon, sunlight filled the entire yard behind the building, the thick, golden sunlight of June. The grass had just been cut, and laughter rang out from the far end of the yard. Milo had removed the training wheels from his bicycle the week before, and had fallen as many times as he needed to fall. And this time, the bicycle held its balance, rolling in a straight line through the long strip of sunlight across the concrete, while the boy laughed loudly enough for the whole yard to hear. Running behind him was a man in a shirt with the sleeves rolled up, one hand hovering lightly behind the seat, and when he saw that the wheels were steady, he let go. There were no bodyguards standing at the corners of the yard. There was no black car parked outside the gate. On the back step, the old work boots had long since been cleaned. The leather restored to its original color, placed neatly beside a tiny pair of yellow boots with dinosaurs on the toes. The city had once called him a crime boss. No one called him that anymore, and that was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Some things in life can't be bought with power, and they can't be kept by gripping them more tightly. The strongest person isn't the one who can repay every wrong, but the one who dares to stop at the right moment and accept the price for what he has built. The kindness of a stranger on a cold morning may not change the whole world, but it can change one person, and one changed person can be enough to save many others. If you've stayed with this story until the end, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that each day we can continue listening to more meaningful stories together. How did Delaney and Elias's story make you feel, and what part of it stayed with you most? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May you and your family always have abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.